Hi, and welcome to my presentation. Today, I'll be talking about power and privilege in the classroom. South Korean students flex their English language epistemic resources. This is for AsiaTEFL for December 3rd or 4th of 2021. My name is Maria Lisak, and I'm coming to you from South Korea from Chosun University. The intersection of socio-cultural resources in the English language classroom are analyzed for expressions of identity, power, and agency. Critical pedagogy fosters learning experiences to empower South Korean students to express their cosmopolitan, their global yet local identity while using their non-native language of English. Lesson plans and student work are assessed for expressions of identity, power, and agency as they circulate in the English language classroom. This presentation draws on critical sociocultural theory and critical cosmopolitanism to showcase learners' epistemic privilege as outsiders with the power to use English language instead of it overriding the learner. The presentation also outlines the social justice or critical pedagogy used to create a safe yet empowering atmosphere for English language learners. Learners are South Korean university students studying welfare administration in English. The teacher researcher is a middle-aged white female American who has lived in South Korea for 25 years. This qualitative research study is a practitioner inquiry shared to show how a working model of social justice pedagogy. I'm going to start by talking about the research question and framework, which has guided several of my practitioner inquiries regarding cosmopolitanism. The main question that I always come back to are, how are my students expressing their cosmopolitanism? The theoretical framework that I'm drawing on is a critical sociocultural theory because I want to look at the power, the identity, and agency, and how those things are circulating in my classroom. Ontologically, my students, I'm drawing on an ontology of place, which was brought to me through Hawkins. This ontology of place helps to understand global topics from my students' uniquely Korean perspective. Epistemologically, I think my students are at an advantage being non-native English speakers. This is an epistemic resource. Their epistemic resources as outsiders to English helps them critique and situate English and especially different global issues within their world. So this brings us to kind of the title of this particular presentation. We're focusing on power because that power is from my students' place in their way of being in the world. And we're thinking about their privilege because their actual epistemic resource is a type of etic positionality. And this helps them to know their world. So they are non-native English speakers and automatically being positioned as an etic personality, or excuse me, etic positionality outside of English, I think is a special power and critique that they can bring. So their etic position is a power, not a deficit to understanding and to being able to know the world. I'm going to take only a very small slice of my larger study and talk about this. And I'm going to give an example of critical sociocultural expression of cosmopolitan agency. I'm doing this by looking at cosmopolitan identity expressed through my learners' discussion responses and their reflections on those responses. Specifically, I've chosen a discussion topic that they chose of refugees. I will also take a look at how my students are negotiating distance, negotiating proper distance, and how that distance between the topic of refugees, between the topic of imagined others of refugees, and being able to negotiate distance of agreeing and disagreeing with their own classmates about the topic of refugees. And I'm also going to be looking at changes in hospitality over time. initial findings that the students showed hospitality towards refugees that were very extemporaneous and not very well thought out. And then later in the year, they expressed much more detailed and criticality regarding refugees. Cosmopolitan literacies are learners' critical cosmopolitan, their thoughtful engagement of global topics to make meaning within their everyday local lives. And I bring this to you kind of through Hansen, Delante, and several others. The proper distance element that I'm using within the cosmopolitan framework comes from Hull and Storianolo. And this is when learners are developing some agency through negotiating proper distance with each other as with the materials. And I'm also looking at the cosmopolitan aspect of hospitality, specifically kind of radical demonstrations or expressions of hospitality, how learners experience globalization through their interaction. And this looks to the wider political and social boundaries in order to have a more inclusive nature. Basically, I come to this through Campano from his 2016 work, but also this is a kind of ethos of care that underlines my pedagogy and my critical pedagogy and social justice pedagogy, because I'm hoping to kind of get that insider-outsider stance, that polemic between two areas, not to be reproduced, that my students can have a chance to be able to develop many different perspectives and to kind of glide between this insider-outsider stance when talking about different global issues. This is from an action research study done from 2018. I had 54 students who are studying welfare administration. This is a second-year course about their major that they have to take in English. And I noticed the difference over 2 semesters of studying with these students. In the spring semester, they were much more hospitable overall, but their expressions of their hospitality was very generalized. Whereas in the fall, we had an instance and a thread where refugees became a hot topic, and the discussion was very, very deep and challenging to everyone. And everyone had to put in time to develop their answers much more critically. As I mentioned, I use critical pedagogy, and specifically in this instance, students were allowed to choose their own topic for their student inquiry. And I think this is very important about how it guided the discussion. This is not something teacher initiated, but something student initiated. And one of the things that I do ask my students to continue to bring to their inquiry is to imagine themselves as a future public administrator or social welfare worker. In the spring, we had an opportunity to watch a TED Talk on refugees and to apply that to South Korea. I'll share my findings regarding that. And then in the fall of that year, we had 2 different instances where learners had a chance to talk about refugees. In September, when I elicit what my students want to talk about for their small group discussions, they have a chance to talk briefly about that. They wanted to talk about the issue of refugees. And then later in the semester, the students get to revisit these small group discussions that we had in a more general way and choose them to have a presentation on and to be able to develop more discussion on this. And so in November, 1 student chose this topic of refugees again. They did an in-depth research and presented on that topic. Then there were further discussion questions that the students created. They wrote their answers before talking to anybody for a second time. They discussed the topic again, much more in depth. Then they also went online and in both real time and asynchronously answered each other's opinions by even agreeing or disagreeing with each other. So during this spring and fall of 2018, I noticed a change in hospitality. In spring, the students, when this topic was introduced, they were very hospitable, but with very little support. In the fall of that year, this is a topic that I did not bring up, but they brought up. And this topic that they brought up, after we had already studied it in spring of the year, there had been media cover over the summer about refugees coming to South Korea from Yemen. And the students expressed a wider range of opinions regarding refugees coming and the hospitality given to them, with much more developed support about their opinion. It seems that when the topic of refugees was more theoretical in my students' imaginations, they were, I don't know, less motivated, less interest, less moved to do more than express an uncritical yet welcome attitude to the refugees as a general public good that must be done. Of course, we should welcome refugees. After an increase in media attention over the summer around the arrival and integration of the Yemeni refugees, opinions became much more nuanced and much more deeply and realistically supported, addressing issues of Islamophobia that were not present in earlier discussions. In spring of 2012, my students watched David Miliband about the refugee crisis is a test of our character. This was a prompt, and I asked them to apply this talk to South Korea. And the students, overall, 77% of them, the 54 students that were that responded, looked at refugees as in need of assistance by South Korea. So South Korea should step up and help the refugees in the world. And we can see here a pretty strong, pretty positive affiliation. And we show two students actually reporting that they've changed their mind. They didn't think we should help refugees, but then we should help refugees after watching the talk. And we had about 15% of students looking negatively as refugees impacting South Korea. 5 students emphasized that refugees are not South Korea's problem. So refugees in the world are not something we need to deal with. And 3 people were actively against welcoming refugees, but they also did not offer any explanation about why they felt that. So this was springtime. We have a predominant amount of students reporting that South Korea should do something to help the refugees. And during 2018, Yemeni refugees were welcomed. There was an issue of them going to Jeju Island and then being incorporated into South Korea mainland. And over the summer, there were a lot of negative views about the integration and the trouble that was going on. In November of that year, so the students brought up this topic again in fall, and we had a student give a presentation about this topic, and then we had further in-depth discussions where the students needed to support their opinions more. And here I've color-coded students who were starting to agree with not letting refugees in. I have a student color-coded here in yellow that is kind of on the fence, and I have a student color-coded in green about why refugees still should be welcomed. So these answers are much more complicated, addressing the issues of Islamophobia, talking about the issues of between different countries, the way that refugees are vetted are not standardized, and this lack of standardization creates problem. So South Korea is piggybacking on other countries' vetting of refugees, but the other country doesn't have the same stringent vetting process. And so there was a gap between that. So refugees came in without being fully vetted South Korean style, but South Korean officials accepted that these Yemeni refugees were already vetted in another country, therefore they were allowed in. And there was a lot of friction regarding this. So it was a structural and systemic type of problem, but also the students often talked about the personal and stereotypical problems of South Koreans not being well educated about Islam and what Islam is and how Islamic people can assimilate successfully into a South Korean atmosphere. I'd like to move now to take a look at the student who agreed. So I agree with this student's opinion. I think the root cause of the refugee problem is hatred of Islam. South Korea is not an Islamic culture, and it can create prejudice against Islam because Koreans have fewer chances to meet people directly. I think that in order to solve this problem, we should actually have chances to meet Muslims in person, or the government and NGO should conduct campaigns with an initiative to learn about Islam right away. While Koreans are disgusted with Islam, I think that there are limits in persuading people no matter what the government does. I find this article particularly interesting because my students are supposed to be thinking like administrators and welfare administrators particularly. And so they're looking at this systemic structural problem about the vetting of the Yemeni refugees. And they're mentioning that this problem needs to be addressed systemically. It needs to be the government that comes in that does education to help not just the Muslims coming to assimilate to South Korea, but the South Koreans to be able to understand the Muslims coming into the country to settle. And the student also mentions that there is this government aspect, but then there's this societal aspect. And the mention of Koreans are disgusted with Islam, I think is very telling for my students. Many times they don't want to be critical of their own culture, especially in a non-native language. So as a person who has lived here 25 years, when I read this, I was very surprised that my student was able to trust our space enough to be able to be critical of their own country and their own people. This type of cosmopolitanism is very interesting and I think very important for my students to have a safe space to be able to have these types of discussions as they figure out and understand their deep mind about issues that perhaps they are not encouraged to think or talk about. This has been a short example of cosmopolitanism on the ground. My students trying to be cosmopolitan in the world today in their own unique South Korean version of it. Using critical sociocultural theory to look at learners' power, identity, and agency to discuss global topics helps researchers and educators like myself, as well as hopefully you, how learners are grounding their own kind of cosmopolitanism. So this is not a universal kind of style. There are all these different kinds of interpretations of cosmopolitanism going on, and we need to document them and be able to see and understand them. Through an ontology of place from the Korean vantage point, learners move from an imagined hospitality to the reality of actually being hospitable to global others. This movement from imagined to real also shows an increase in their criticality of their cosmopolitan expressions as they negotiate that distance between themselves, between others, and between these global issues in the world. The learners' epistemic resources as outsiders of English to critique and situate global issues within their world is not a deficit to discussing these issues, but it's rather gives those learners a special privilege or position of power to look at that insider-outsider complexity of culture and language in knowing and being in the world. I invite you to share your comments or your takeaways from this presentation, and hopefully we can have a respectful discussion about how cosmopolitanism in the world is being elevated, discussed, and continuously under negotiation. Thank you so much. I will provide a reference list for you that you can go and take a look at. Please contact me at kwangjumaria@yahoo.com. And thank you so much for this opportunity.